Yes, good. Thank you. So instead of Banu speaking, I will be giving a short presentation on this topic, protection and destruction of heritage from the Second World War to the war in Ukraine. And I want to present a little bit my research on how cultural heritage was dealt with and treated in different ways in the Nordic countries in the Second World War, and compare that to what is happening and how Russia is acting when it comes to cultural heritage in Ukraine today. I think we know that through history, military forces in different kinds of wars have attacked the cultural symbols of the enemy very often, and destroyed different kinds of monuments in order to annihilate the culture of the enemy. That's something we are well aware of. But when I think we can say also that when buildings and other kinds of heritage are damaged through violence, they are not just changed materially, damaged, but also their meanings, what they mean to people also changes. Destruction also adds new meanings, new layers of meaning to these sites or objects. This has not least been shown in research on iconoclasms, that is kind of waves of destruction against heritage and monuments of different sorts. That this is not just material destruction, it's actually the creation of new meanings also, and a change of memories, collective memories in society. And that's very much what I would like to elaborate a little bit on here. I will talk about maybe, let's say, two different ways of looking at protection and destruction of cultural heritage in war, and especially from an historian's point of view. I think that we've all heard and read about how cultural heritage has been affected in different ways in the war in Ukraine today, and we have been able to read about looting of museums, destruction of religious buildings and so on, that Russian forces have been accused of being guilty to. And I wanted to try to maybe understand this way of acting in war. Like, why is this destruction taking place? Is there maybe a bigger idea behind this? And begin by looking a bit at the Second World War and how, let's say, totalitarian states behaved in the Nordic countries in the Second World War, which I write about in my recent book, published in Swedish, Värden, värna, or Values to Safeguard in English, with the subtitle of Cultural Heritage as a State Interest in the Nordic countries during the Second World War. It became quite apparent that states had an interest in cultural heritage in this region during these years, and I will just have to touch upon this very briefly and talk a little bit about the Nazi occupation of Norway from 1940 and on, where we could see that Germany didn't just occupy Norway for strategic military reasons. There were also, within the Nazi leadership, a strong interest in Nordic heritage, especially the kind of ancient features of Norwegian heritage that we see in the ornamentation of the wooden stave churches from the early medieval age, and runic inscriptions which talk to and spoke to this Nazi ideology, which held Nordic culture in high esteem. There were also intangible dimensions of heritage that the Nazis were very much interested in and used in a very deliberate, systematic way. The German SS funded a lot of so-called research on cultural heritage in Norway during these years of occupation. And also the top head of the SS, Heinrich Himmler, even visited Norway in 1941. He took part of an extensive trip through Norway to explore cultural heritage in this country and listen, for example, to traditional music. Here we see the instrument Lange Lake being played on by a famous folk music player in Norway at this time, at the Norwegian Museum of Folk Culture in Oslo at the time. So this is an example of kind of a systematic use of heritage in an occupied area for ideological purposes, and where the Germans also explicitly talked about protecting Norwegian heritage. This was nothing they wanted to destroy, rather they wanted to integrate this into Nazi ideology and also use it to build more friendly relations with the Norwegian people in order to make them more cooperative and to recruit members to the Waffen-SS. So we can continue here. Another way of looking at heritage protection in the Second World War was carried out by the Allied forces from 1943 and onwards, with a Monuments and Fine Arts unit that was created by the Allies in preceding the invasion of Italy in the summer of 1943. They are popularly called the Monuments Men. And in this case, the aim of this unit was not to kind of use heritage for ideological purposes, but it was to, there were actually two goals of this unit. And one was to kind of try to protect cultural objects in Europe, especially in France and Italy, these nations that were known to the Allied forces for having a very rich history and heritage, and to protect these from the destruction and also from the military operations of the Allies, to go just ahead of the troops at the front and do their best to kind of protect these objects from destruction. And then the second goal that kind of developed over time was to retrieve looted items that had been taken by Nazi Germany and try to find the rightful owners of this property. So that was quite a different aim than what the Nazis had in Norway when they tried to use this heritage for their own purposes. Reminding more of the Nazi way of approaching heritage, I think, was something that is actually much less known, but has been written about in academic research, especially in this book by Konstantin Akinsha and Grigory Koslov, one journalist and one art historian from Russia who migrated to Germany at the fall of the Soviet Union. And with them, they took a lot of archives from Russia, showing how these so-called trophy brigades of the Soviet Russian army had been acting at the end of the Second World War and in the years immediately after the war. So the Soviet army, when advancing into enemy territory, that is into, for example, into Germany towards the end of the war, had explicit orders from Stalin to loot as much as they could from German museums and, let's say, German castles and other places with a lot of art collections, and bring it back to the Soviet Union. At this point, there was this plan of Joseph Stalin to actually create a kind of Russian super museum in Moscow with all this war booty collected. Very similar to the idea that Adolf Hitler had of creating a kind of a cosmopolitan art museum in Linz in Austria, but that was never realized. And neither was this super museum in Moscow. Instead, most of this loot, which was a huge amount of and unknown, mass of art and archives also, ended up in secret depositories in the Soviet Union and could never be exhibited in museums. So that is one reason why the amount and the character of this war booty remained quite badly known in the West for many decades. And it was first after the collapse of the Soviet Union that let's say, the extent and scale of this looting became more known, with also with the book of these two researchers. This is the place where most of the trophy art was stored, the Trinity St. Sergius Monastery in Zagorsk, for a very long time. And even after the fall of the Soviet Union, Russia has kind of denied any guilt for looting Germany and other countries at the end of the Second World War, and has not agreed to return any of these objects. This actually went on not until the end of the war, but until 1948. So actually, for 3 years after the war, German museums in the occupied areas were continuously looted by these trophy brigades. So there were similarities between the Soviet way and the Nazi way of organizing this kind of looting and, let's say, purpose-driven use of cultural heritage in enemy territory, I think. So protection, let's say, can mean different things. It's not just countries defending them against an enemy that say that they are protecting heritage, but also aggressive states often argue that they are protecting heritage in the occupied areas by, for example, evacuating it out of this area to safer areas. And often when you hear about protection, it's kind of, well, it has a very positive aura around it, that you're actually trying to rescue, safeguard something from someone who may have evil or harmful intentions. But as one French historian, Elizabeth Campbell-Colescott, has shown in her study of heritage protection in the Vichy regime in France during the German occupation of France, she says that protection is not just a selective strategy carried out by state to try to safeguard the most valuable objects from its own culture and so on. But this kind of protective actions can also be, as she says, assertions of grandeur rooted in a glorious heritage from the past. And it can betray anxieties about a nation's military, diplomatic, and economic strength in the present. So behind these goals of preserving, protecting, can be kind of other purposes of, for example, leaders, being very cautious about the, let's say, loyalty and morale of its population, like it was the case in the Soviet Union during the Second World War. The Soviet people had to make, I mean, extreme sacrifices during the war, and there were a lot of pressure on the Soviet state during the war and also in the war, in the years following the war. So the historian of Russian heritage politics, John Maddox, he has argued that Stalin wanted to use heritage actually to Soviet Russian heritage to try to forge the Soviet nation together, glorifying, for example, the Tsarist history of Russia, and also, you know, using looting as a strategy to for this purpose. Another example that I bring up in my book is the looting of the Soviet trophy brigades in Karelia, in the it was the borderland between Finland and the Soviet Union. So Karelia was both in Finland and in the Soviet Union. And this area was fought over, and ultimately it ended up in, you know, on the Soviet side towards the end of the war. But here we saw a combination of destruction, vandalism, and systematic looting. There were vandalism of Orthodox churches, like we see one example to the left. There were kind of cultural centers and museums in Karelia that were turned into these exhibits glorifying the Soviet army and Joseph Stalin and his politics by celebrating the troops in pictures and by exhibiting, like we see here, grenades, weapons that have been taken from the enemy. But we also had the Orthodox icons that became an asset in the struggle between Finland and Soviet Union. So Finland actually brought a lot of Orthodox icons from churches and the homes of people in Karelia to Helsinki to safeguard them, as they said. But in 1944, when there were peace negotiations between Soviet Union and Finland, Finland had to return almost all of these Orthodox icons to the Soviet Union. So they became assets in the peace negotiations. Just a few of them remained in Helsinki. So this was actually heritage that both these nations were kind of competing for and claiming their right to. As you may know, Leningrad was subjected to a kind of existential siege during from 1941, when Germany attacked the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union, that had been in a kind of offensive position, attacking Finland, Poland, the Baltic states previously, were now under attack from its former ally, Nazi Germany, from the summer of 1941. And the Germans launched not only, you know, a war to win Russian territory, but also it was very much a war on Russian heritage. The German commander of on the Eastern Front, Walter von Reichenau, he explicitly told his troops to destroy as much as they could of historic monuments and heritage that they found. So it was not just about killing people. He wanted them also to destroy as much of their cultural property as possible. That is very clear. And in Leningrad, this became perhaps more evident than anywhere else in the Soviet Union. Leningrad was subjected to a siege that lasted for 2.5 years, which was a huge challenge, not just for the population of Leningrad that suffered from this siege, but also it was portrayed by Soviet leadership as a kind of existential struggle of the Soviet society. Because Leningrad was not just an important city, it was also the former capital of Russia, and it had, during Stalin's regime in the 1930s, it had been given the role of kind of portraying and representing the glorious past of the Russian Empire. So that's also a reason, I think, why Leningrad was so fiercely defended by the Soviet Russians. So here we see soldiers outside the Hermitage that was the entrance to the Hermitage. So what is, I would like to try to compare this then to a bit what is happening in the south of Ukraine today when Russian forces are retreating from Kherson, making it more apparent, you know, what has happened in this area during the occupation this year. Museums have been looted. A lot of collections from Kherson have been brought to Russian territory, Russian-controlled territory, and we don't know where they are today. Maybe you have also heard that the human remains of Grigory Potemkin, who was buried in the cathedral of Kherson, has also been, you know, removed. He is one of the, you know, one of the heroic heroic persons from 18th century Tsarist Russia. So I think when looking at what is taking place then with this kind of evacuation of what the Russians claim are of their heritage, reminds very much of the actions of the Soviet trophy brigades towards the end of the Second World War, and also reminds of how Nazi Germany used heritage during these years. I would like to make some conclusions here finally, because I'm going to end here. I would like to stress 4 observations that are made here and try to argue that you know, protection of heritage, while it may sound as being a defensive act, something you do to safeguard assets against an enemy, you know, this is also something that forces that are engaged in aggressive wars also argue that they do, that they carry out with legitimacy. It could also be the fact that states don't actually share norms for how to behave in wars, despite that we have international conventions that many warring states have said that they will actually follow. We could see this in the Second World War as well, that even though all the warring parties at the outset of the war promised that they would follow international conventions, you know, after only a day or two, the Germans showed that this had no relevance when they attacked Poland and immediately targeted the cultural heritage of Poland, just as an example. I think there is a degree of continuity in how powers like Russia and also the Western powers relate to cultural heritage that we can see still today also. And lastly, as I also showed with the example of Karelia and the Orthodox icons, we can see that cultural objects, heritage, become assets in peace negotiations. And I think it's not very unlikely that in the future, you know, claims will be made on Russia to actually return at least some of the collections that have been taken from Ukraine. But, you know, we can't know what can come out of this, since if we look at the past, the Soviet Union, for example, never acknowledged any kind of guilt or any kind of will to return anything of what had been looted in the Second World War. So can we expect Russia to change its behavior compared to how the Soviet Union acted? I'm not so sure. Okay, I'm going to end there. This was a presentation I put together in a haste, you know, following Barbara Picol's that she was not able to come here. So I think that we can proceed with the presentations, and maybe if you have any, if there is any short question, we can take it immediately. Otherwise, we can wait until we have heard all three presentations and have some discussion. I would say that if there are questions here in the room, we need to use these, the cube as a microphone. Yeah, in order for our participants on Zoom to hear also. Yeah, okay. You have to keep it very close to your.
I was not going to ask anything. I was just.
Yeah. Okay.
I was just wondering whether it was me to come up now and talk.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. Sure. You can come up. And we can, please, we can have some tea and coffee perhaps while you're preparing. Yeah.